Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. Today, Jeanne Calment, Jeanne Calment, who is a Frenchwoman, hence my attempt at a French accent, which, I mean, of all accents, I think my French is pretty good. It's not, is it? I just said it and it's bad. Welcome to the show! I would say one of my writers, in this case Katie, has written me a script. It's all about the oldest person who ever lived, and who is possibly not the oldest person who ever lived, because they're a fake. A dirty, dirty fake. Straight from a Chinese factory. Probably not. She wasn't made in a Chinese factory. But as far as I know, she did claim to be born at some point, but there was just no birth certificate or anything, so no one really knows. Let's jump in. I once had a story that really stuck in my mind, and as the years went by, I would periodically remember it. But as I got older and more cynical, I started to think that maybe it was exaggerated. Here's what I read in something like Reader's Digest or a Crazy Facts book many moons ago. A man met an elderly lady who had some sort of amazing apartment in Paris. As she was very old and had no close family to pass it on to, he struck a deal. He would make, I've heard this story, he'd make payments until her death, at which time she would leave the apartment to him in her will. She could continue living in the apartment the whole time, so it sounded like a great deal for all concerned. The only thing was, the woman kept on living. She lived so long, in fact, that not only did she become the oldest woman in France, she became the oldest person to have ever lived. The man died before she did. That sucks. Having paid over twice what the apartment was worth. I recently remembered this story, so I looked into it and I found out that not only was it 100% true, it was just a small part of the story of Jeanne Calment, one of the world's oldest people. Her story is so interesting, in fact, that we're making a whole episode about her. Indeed we are, right now. You're watching it, or listening to it if you're on podcasts. Hello there, podcast fans. But what's the decoding part, you might ask? Well, all might not be quite as it seems in the murky world of extreme longevity, but we'll get to that. First of all, let's have a brief jaunt through the life of who Guinness World Records calls the oldest person ever. But as we all know, Guinness World Records, in my humble opinion, absolutely not a statement of fact, is a crock of shit. Because Guinness World Records, allegedly, they'll only come to verify your record if you pay them. So I don't think they really care. Allegedly, in my opinion. I've also heard they're litigious, allegedly, in my opinion. Was that Guinness? It was someone. It was someone who's litigious. There are litigious people out there, Simon. What? The oldest person ever. Jean-Louise Calment was born in February 1875, the same year that gallium was discovered. The Civil Rights Act was passed in the US for all the good that did, and the UK said hello to its first funicular lift that was open to passengers. Oh, that's like a lift that goes up a hill. That's cool. He says in the same line where the Civil Rights Act was passed. Could also say that was pretty cool. That's the one that ends slavery, right? I mean, Katie says for all the good that did. Wait, that was the one that ended slavery. And look, I know, obviously, there's all sorts of problems still, but at least there's not slavery in America. Yay? Calment was born in Arles, a city in southern France, and spent her entire life there. Handily, for researchers into her life, she never changed her surname because she married her cousin, Ferdinand Calment. It was the past, though, 1800s. There people were still marrying their cousins. I heard I'm not sure if this is like an urban legend, but it also is probably 100% true, that throughout all of history, half of marriages have been between cousins because it used to be so common. For some reason, family trees do a number on my brain, and I got all confused. But get this, their paternal grandfathers were brothers. Oh my god, that's so complicated. Okay, so far so fine, but their paternal grandmothers were sisters. So I think that means a pair of sisters married 2 generations up Calment brothers. I get confused after that personally. I'm not familiar with any one of my grandparents' siblings, but basically this means that Jean and Ferdinand were what were called double second cousins because they shared cousins from both sides of their family. I think. Still a bit close for my liking, but hey, it all panned out all right for Jean. According to Statista.com, the average life expectancy for a French person in 1875 was 40.29 years. Good God, we've come a long way in a very short amount of time. That must not be accounting for infant mortality, though, surely. But Calment ended up blowing that out of the water by more than tripling it. Yeah, this is the thing. People think all people died young in the past. It's like, no, once you kind of make it past childhood and into middle age, your chances of living to be old were pretty good. You think back at all those, philosophers and they were all old. I mean, for the most part. You think of their statues and they were, old. Ferdinand's side of the family was pretty well-to-do and owned a large store in Arles with 2 apartments above it for them to live in. It's variously referred to as a dry goods store or a drapery store, but I saw a photo of it that had a sign saying Maison Calment on the roof and Le Grand Magasin de Nouveautés. Okay, going on around it, making it a department store as opposed to a small shop. Jeanne didn't have to work and spent her time doing such diverse activities as playing music with friends, hunting wild boar, roller skating and mountaineering. It's a wonder you live a long time when you just live a life of leisure. She and Ferdinand had a daughter, Yvonne, who was born in 1898 when Jeanne was 23. Yvonne married a man named Joseph Belot, who, going against tradition, does not appear to be a relation. That's nice. A little bit of genetic diversity in there. And they had one son, Frédéric, who was Jeanne's only grandchild. Unfortunately, Yvonne died young in 1934 after suffering from tuberculosis and actually died on her 36th birthday. It's always weird when someone dies who's younger than me, because I'm like, I've lived a year longer than that. Yeah, that'd be weird.
That's very weird.
As a result, Jeanne and Ferdinand became closer to their son-in-law Joseph and their young grandson, Frederick. In 1942, Jeanne and her husband Fernand went to a friend's house for dinner, where there were cherries for dessert. Oh no, someone's going to choke on them or something. While Jeanne ate a few, Fernand ate a lot. The cherries had some kind of chemical or pesticide on them, and Fernand ended up dying from poisoning. Oh my god, the past. At this point, Jeanne was 67. Her son-in-law Joseph moved into the apartment next door, and her grandson also lived nearby with his wife. More tragedy struck Jeanne in 1963 when her first son Joseph died following a long illness, then Frederick was killed in a car accident. Her older brother having died the year before, Jeanne was basically left with no family. She was now 88, with 3.5 decades left in the tank. That's so sad. Like, I don't want to be old and have all my family die. That'd be really sad. A few years later, obvious statement of the century, I don't want to die old and alone in an apartment that someone else owns, although I would feel good about getting my money's worth. A few years later is where my story from the start comes in. Here's the verified version from a piece by Lauren Collins on the New Yorker website. When Calment was 94 in 1969, her notary bought her apartment. The purchase was made under the French en vigueur system, in which the buyer agrees to make regular payments on a property that the seller continues to live in. In such an arrangement, the buyer essentially wagers on how quickly the seller will die. It's all very morbid, isn't it? The Calment apartment proved to be an epically terrible investment. By the time the notary died in 1995, it spent nearly $200,000, more than twice the value of the place, without ever taking occupancy. Didn't we say this was an apartment in Paris? $100,000. Please. The death of the notary aside, I was quite delighted to find that the story had been true, and that I'd remembered it so well, apart from thinking it had been in Paris when Calment had spent her whole life living in Arles. Oh, okay, so it's not Paris. But still, I don't know anything about Arles. It could be terrible and cheap. She actually stayed in that same apartment above what had been the Calment family store until she was 110, and then she moved into a nursing home. It wasn't because she was extremely decrepit or anything, far from it in fact. She'd been staying in that place so long she'd gotten used to having few modern conveniences like central heating, so one day it was really cold and she decided to unfreeze the boiler by climbing up onto a table and using a candle to warm it up. I don't know about you, but I'm not even half the age that she was, and I still find it a bit dicey if I have to clamber up on anything that requires a step stool or a chair to reach it. Yeah, me too, but that's not because I'm old, it's just because I have epically terrible balance. I work out with a trainer in the gym these days, and I'll be like doing lunges, and I'll just be falling over, and he'll be like, dude, do you want to hold on to my hands? Or like, do you want a stick to support yourself? And I'm like, yeah, it's probably for the best, isn't it? And he's like, you should work on your balance. And I'm like, dude, it's not working on my balance. My balance is just shit. Anyway, she didn't fall off and hurt herself, but she did apparently start a small fire. So she agreed to move somewhere with a few more creature comforts. She maintained a daily routine to keep sharp, and in 1991, at the age of 116, she became the oldest verified person to have ever lived. A year later, she gave up smoking. Well, she is French. On the 4th of August 1997, she died at the age of 122 years and 164 days. Because she made it past 110, Calment is what's known as a super centenarian. So far, the next oldest verified living person has been a measly 119 years old, a distant second place in gerontology terms. Gerontology being the study of various factors involved in aging. In fact, Calment lived so much longer than any other supercentenarian that she is habitually referred to as an outlier in the data. So, was she just a one-off, a combination of good fortune and some shared DNA? Was it the incest and the smoking that led her a long, healthy life? I don't know, like, the British royal family live a long-ass time. And they're pretty incestuous, or at least they used to be, right? Why, with greater knowledge of diet and exercises and advances in science and medicine over the past 30-odd years, haven't we seen anyone else get close to a record? Here's an excerpt from Lauren Collins' piece in The New Yorker again. The passage of time often quells controversy, but in the Calment case, it only unsettled the dust. As the world's population continued to grow, the cohort of people living to the age of 122 did not. More than 2 decades after Calment's death, her record still stood, making her a more conspicuous outlier with every year that went by. Either she had lived longer than any human being ever, or she had executed an audacious fraud. As one observer wrote, both are highly unlikely life stories, but one is true. A fraud, you say? Well, let's get into that, shall we? Yes, let's, Katie. Suspicions of Calment. Suspicions about Jeanne Calment popped up in the 1990s and 2000s, some of which pointed to a cover-up by French authorities, but none of which convinced society at large that the world's oldest person had been a fraud. It wasn't until quite recently, late 2018 in fact, that the fraud train started to gather a little steam. The main people outing Calment were Valery Novoselov, a Russian geriatrician who is somebody specializing in older adult healthcare, and fellow Russian Nikolai Zak, a mathematician. The hypothesis was that Jeanne Calment hadn't died in 1997 at the ripe old age of 122. She'd actually died in 1934 at the age of 59, and the person crowned the oldest human to ever live was in fact her daughter Yvonne, who was in reality a mere whippersnapper at 199 years of age. Wait, so she just took her mum's identity? This is the thing. I recently made a video about how to get a new identity for another channel I do, and I was like, holy shit, it was pretty easy in the past. They do have some good points. The chances of a person living to past 120 are practically nil. Sure, increasing numbers of people are hitting 100 all the time, but in the whole of human history, only one woman, Jeanne Calment, has ever confirmed to have done it. I expect the number of supercentenarians will increase in the future, but seeing as in the past records weren't necessarily the best kept or most accurate, it's been difficult to check an older person's age with 100% accuracy. Use that new ChatGPT thing. Deep research. Hey, ChatGPT, deep research, go find this out. And it'll be like, I found some French records. You're like, yeah, you did. To quote Norris McWhirtler, okay, whose name sounds made up. Yep, but it was actually the co-founder of Guinness World Records. Quote, no single subject is more obscured by vanity, deceit, falsehood, and deliberate fraud than the extremes of human longevity. I don't know, I'd say finance is pretty obscured by vanity, deceit, falsehood, and deliberate fraud. You see, going back a few decades, anyone could say that they were really old, and most people would just believe them, especially if they were from remote areas. That is why Calment was so special, because her life was documented. But, as we know, things can be fudged, mistakes can be made, and things can fall through the cracks, even in so-called modern systems. We know that people commit social security or pension fraud, claiming money for relatives who've already died, but eventually the government catches up with them. Well, they should anyway. According to an article on the BBC that was fact-checking some of a certain car-maker billionaire's claims recently, quote, there is a 2023 report by the Social Security Inspector General which identified 19 million people born in 1920 or earlier who didn't have any death data on file, 44,000 of them who were still receiving social benefits. Oh, okay, I'm so confused about what this got to do with Elon Musk, but it's because he's doing that efficiency thing, isn't he? 19 million people with no death date? Well, that's a lot of people. And there are apparently over 100,000 people over the age of 100 in the US, so there should be a lot more of them receiving Social Security. I don't really understand the numbers here, and it's not that relevant to our story, but it gave recent stats, so I thought it was worth putting in. Nikolai Zak, in particular, was interested in the numbers, though, and being a mathematician, I guess that's kind of his jam. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? In February 2019, he published an article called Evidence that Jeanne Calment died in 1934, not 1997. A refreshingly straightforward title with no weird subtitle, totally unlike usual reading fare on Decoding the Unknown. Indeed, whether it's some crazy book that some crackpot's written or really, an academic journal piece, they always have crazy titles. And in the academic journal, I just mean crazy long, and for the crackpot stuff, just crazy. His first point is one of probability. Of a set of French supercentenarians, i.e. people living past 110 years, Jeanne Calment has lived the longest and was also the oldest, i.e. first identified of the set. Nobody born later has lived longer. Zak estimated the plausibility of the longest living person having set the record by 1998 is approximately 0.014%. I think that's his conclusion. Anyway, I was at the end of an equation that I didn't understand. Basically, he found it very unlikely. That's the main takeaway here. He also did a Monte Carlo simulation of the equation that I didn't understand. I have no idea what that is. This takes random sampling to predict possible outcomes, and this produced a graph showing survival rates for people after the age of 105. Zach made the sample 5,000 people, even though that many people have never been confirmed to have reached 110. Anyway, once again, when her data was added, Calment was a massive outlier. Zach had got to the story via gerontologist Valery Novoselov, a fellow Russian who had seen some photos of late-life Calment and, thanks to his expertise at treating the elderly, was extremely suspicious as to the age of the alleged oldest person to have ever lived. According to Novoselov, he didn't see someone who was 110, as Jeanne was in the picture at the time. He saw a strong lady, a little younger than 90. This also tracks in the Yvonne is Jeanne idea, as if their identities had been switched. When the person in question died around 12 years later, Yvonne would have been 99. Novoselov couldn't seem to get over what good nick Jeanne was in for an extremely old person. She was still walking independently until she was 115. She could sit up straight without help and smoked basically her entire life. In an article in Novoselov titled The Consequences of the Professional Geriatric Evaluation of the Oldest Human, he also points out, quote, the prevalence of dementia syndrome in women at the age of 90 years is 27% and decreases to 70% in the age group of 99 years. Thus, the absence of pronounced cognitive impairment on the level of dementia in a woman over 115 years old could not help but raise questions among scientists who validated her age, but we do not see them. Basically, she was just too with it and in too fine a physical health for his liking. And I mean, fair enough, he's treated a lot of really old people. He's got a really good base knowledge of old people getting kind of fucked up as they get older. Apart from just the sheer unlikelihood of Jean's age, what else did the detractors have? In 1934, Yvonne supposedly died due to complications of having tuberculosis, and I've also seen pleurisy and pneumonia given as causes of death. Her death certificate was not signed by a doctor or medical expert, but rather a woman in her 70s who was listed as being unemployed. Nikolai Zach theorized that Jeanne also had TB, whether contracted from Yvonne or elsewhere, and because it was seen as something of a shameful disease at the time, Jeanne withdrew from public view and Yvonne eventually recovered. With Jeanne hiding away, Yvonne started using her ID for various administrative and legal tasks, and when Jeanne died, she just carried on the pretense in order to avoid inheritance tax. The Calments owned a farm, and at least one other property aside from the building housing their store and apartments. According to Zach's paper, tax rates for child heirs were about 35% in the mid-1930s, meaning that the remaining Calments might be on the hook for a pretty penny in the event of Jeanne's death. Worth covering up her death? It's not like that's never happened. The Calments sold their store. Weren't they keeping that guy alive? They're like, it wasn't Samsung, was it? Some big Japanese company. Korean company? I don't remember. It was some big Asian company. And the guy who started it, he was like old, like real old, like in a coma and stuff. And they were just keeping him alive, like on machines, so that he wouldn't be legally dead. And the inheritance tax wouldn't like screw up the entire operation. Weird. I don't know if he's still alive. Maybe he is. Just keeping him alive on a machine so they just pumping those lungs. The Calments sold their store in 1937, meaning that if they were in some financial difficulties then, there would probably have been evidence in 1934. Because of the convoluted tax issues in France at the time, the Calments may have been worse off than we realized, especially as both branches of Jeanne and Fernand's family tree were closer than average. Jean's parents had died in 1924 and 1931, and Fernand's mother also died in 1931. As she would have been the owner of the store, this would have kick-started some inheritance tax issues for Jeanne and Fernand, as per an article by longevity biotech entrepreneur Yuri Daigen. Quote, in France, inheritance laws are quite peculiar even today, and they were considerably more so in the 1930s. Even inheritance between spouses was taxed. Wait, that's not taxed? I didn't even know that. The rule was only abolished in 2007. Moreover, the surviving husband had the same rights to the property of his deceased wife, or even to half of their joint property, as her children and even cousins. All right. Therefore, if it was Jeanne who died in 1934, the financial impact on her family could have been quite severe. Her husband would have to pay considerable tax on his large store. Moreover, he already did so just recently, as his own mother passed away in 1931, and she most likely was the original heiress to the store. That sucks. Wait, So someone inherits something, they pay the tax on it, and then they die, and the next person to inherit just immediately has to pay more tax on it. You'd be like, never thought about that. That's really unfortunate. Daigen also points out that if Jeanne had been slowly dying from the effects of tuberculosis, this would have given her family, particularly her husband Fernand, time to put the switch idea into place. Neither Jeanne nor Yvonne are listed in the building in the 1931 census, although Jeanne's husband and Yvonne's husband are both on there, as well as Yvonne's son, a couple of servants, and Fernand's mother, i.e. Jeanne's mother-in-law. Is this really the best way to avoid inheritance tax? Like, to fake that you're your own mum? I feel like there must be a better way than living your whole life as a different person. Yvonne's funeral was a big event in Arles, but the casket was closed and Jeanne was in mourning. Zach posits that a switch had occurred before, and therefore death from such a severe infection could have also been an excuse to keep the dead woman caskets closed and to justify the living woman wearing a heavy veil. Is it also not like open caskets are just not like in the UK? We just don't do that. Like, I watched that TV show 6 Feet Under, and they're all like making the bodies beautiful and stuff so people can look at them. And it's like, we don't do that. We just have a coffin and it's closed. Like, I don't even think they can open. It's just, we don't like looking at dead people. It is a bit weird, to be honest. It's like, you want to say goodbye to a dead person? He also notes, unlike her mother's, son's, and husband's names, Yvonne's name is not present on the tombstone of the familial grave. Suspicious, no? Valery Novoselov noticed more obvious evidence of a switch when he started examining photos of Jeanne and her daughter. In a verified photo of Yvonne, she appears to have a small fibroma or growth on the end of her nose. In a photo of Jeanne at 114, the same or similar growth can be seen, although it's not apparent in later photos, meaning it could have been removed. It does not appear in photos of Jeanne at a much younger age. Another tell is that Jeanne's eye colour mysteriously changed. In the 1930s, her eye colour was given as black on an identity card, but then was given as grey when she died. Zach contends that they were actually green. Height is also another suspicious factor for the two Russian naysayers. The 1930s ID card had a height at 152 centimetres, just shy of 5 feet tall, or topping Danny DeVito by nearly 2 inches. Wow, Danny DeVito's really small. I knew Danny DeVito was small, but that's really small. 5'9", 4'9". As we age, we shrink. So presumably, after living for 122 years, Jeanne would have been even tinier when she was at her peak. But no, by the age of 114, she was basically still the same at 150 centimetres, mocking Danny DeVito from her lofty perch. Other things popped up throughout her later life too. Her signature changed significantly. She flew under the radar until she moved into the nursing home at 110, and while there she had a distant relative destroy her personal documents. Suspicious, no?
You're being really sus. Just thought I would let you know.
There were also issues with Jeanne's retelling of her life story. While she did have specific recollections of people, places, and events from her youth that turned out to be correct, Nikolai Zach was still not convinced. If she really was Yvonne, she could have easily been coached on various issues, he reasoned, and if she made some mistakes, she could just put it down to forgetfulness. She could also have unintentionally been given the answers to some questions by the people who spent many hours interviewing her about details of her life in order to validate her age claims. Some examples in particular stuck out to Zach. One of them involved Vincent van Gogh, who had moved to Arles in 1888. In interviews in the film Vincent and Me, where she briefly appears as herself, Calment said that Van Gogh would stop by her father's store to buy canvas for his paintings. She didn't particularly like him, calling him things like rough, rude, and ugly as sin, had a vile temper, and smelled of booze. Alright, calm down, Jean. Their timelines did definitely cross, however. If you recall, Jeanne Calment married into the Calments that owned the store. Her own father was a shipwright. If she saw Van Gogh in there when she was a child, it wouldn't even have been her father-in-law's store yet, as she hadn't married Fernand. If the identity switch occurred, however, and Jeanne was actually Yvonne, then yes, it would have been her father's store. This is extremely suspicious. I think she's the mother. Statistically, and also just like this stuff, this sounds like a typical mistake that someone would make. And it's very hard to walk that back with an excuse. There are several more examples that Zach gives where Jeanne names people who couldn't quite possibly have done what she'd said at the time, such as a nanny who walked her to school. When Zach cross-checked the names stated in her biography, the only possible person who could have taken her to school at that time was somebody who was 10 years her junior. Again, if Jeanne really was actually Yvonne, this nanny definitely could have walked with her. The same thing happens with a named piano teacher. When Zach checked, the only matching name was 14 at the time that Jeanne said she was taking lessons at the age of 7. The same person was actually listed as a piano teacher in the census by the time Yvonne was 7, though. This is her, right? It seems very likely that this Zach dude is completely correct. There was also the omission of information about the cholera epidemic which hit Arles in 1884. Apparently, epidemics and other disease outbreaks are handy for research purposes, as they can be used to pinpoint dates and locations more easily. But Calment didn't mention this in her interviews. She also changed details about where she was born and said she'd only lived in one place before getting married, when in reality, the family had moved when she was 13. There would be a surefire way to settle the dispute. Calment donated some blood to a Parisian study called Project Chronos, which maps genes of people over 100 years old to get a better understanding of aging. Because of her parents' slightly incestuous marriage, Yvonne would only have had 12 great-grandparents, whereas most people, including Jean, would have had 16 distinct great-great-grandparents. This blood, however, and the secrets it holds, does not appear to be up for grabs. Yeah, I guess because of privacy and stuff, but we should really test that. One of the strongest pieces of evidence against Calment is the age she lived to itself, so let's find out a bit more about that before we get into the debunking of the debunking. For yes, for every accusation, there is, of course, a defender of Jean's record. In fact, as soon as Nikolai Zach started sounding the fraud alarm, some people formed a Facebook group called, when translated from French, Counter-Investigation of the Jeanne Calment Investigation. All right. Basically, some people from Arles took extreme umbrage with a random Russian bloke besmirching the name of one of their most celebrated residents. The group grew to over 1,500 members, and along with Jean's age validators who spent many hours interviewing her, these citizen detectives dug into Calment's story to try and prove once and for all that Jean's extraordinary longevity was not a hoax. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go into something trying to prove something. You should just go into something to seek the truth. And I think the Zach bloke, he seems to be like an academic. He probably just looked into it to seek the truth. And if he'd have found something else, he'd be like, wow, 122, huh? Longevity corner. Yes, we know that Jean's lifespan of 122 years and 164 days was the longest to be ever validated, and it was still a country mile longer than the next longest lived person when you take into account the mortality rate for centenarians. In 2018, a report was published looking into the death rates for nearly 4,000 very old Italians. Your 80s and 90s are the years when most people bow out. According to Berkeley News, as humans live into their 80s and 90s, mortality rates surge due to fragility and a higher risk of such ailments as heart disease, dementia, stroke, cancer, and pneumonia. The study was carried out by UC Berkeley and Rome's Sapienza University and found that if you manage to make it to 105, your chance of dying within the next year actually levels out a bit. The Berkeley News goes on to say, specifically, the results show that people between the ages of 105 and 109, known as semi-supercentenarians, had a 50-50 chance of dying within the year and an expected further lifespan of 1.5 years. That life expectancy rate was projected to be the same for 110-year-olds or supercentenarians, hence the plateau. The quote ends. While people alive today might think that they could potentially make it to 100, if not a little over, there is a school of thought that aging, instead of being a natural process, is actually a disease in and of itself, and we can cure it. There's potentially no upper limit on human longevity. I believe that. I think aging's a disease. I think it's nice that we're starting to reframe it that way, so we can live longer. It's nice, I'd like to live longer. One of the more colourful characters in this side quest is the Agatha Christie villain-sounding Aubrey de Grey, or to give him his full moniker, Aubrey David Nicholas Jasper de Grey. He sounds like he should be 250 years old, but he's actually 61 and has got a massive beard. He's been involved in various life-prolonging things and was one of the founders of the SENS Foundation, which stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. Sounds complicated. I do know this Aubrey de Grey guy. I've seen him interviewed. I know what he's up to. I think he's quite interesting. Senescence, in case you didn't know, and I didn't, is the process of growing old. This foundation aimed to research the prevention of illness and cognitive issues related to aging, basically prolonging a healthy mind and body for as long as possible. SENS has since merged with a similar company to form what is now called Lifespan Research Institute, and de Grey was kicked out of the company a few years ago for saying rude things to women. Oh. But it's still presumably going in the same direction as when he started it. It sucks to get kicked out of your own company, right? That's really bad. It's funny because when people think about aging well and living longer, we all know it comes down to the same basic things to give ourselves the best chance. A healthy diet, some regular exercise, wearing seatbelts, and centuries of other people's genes. Yeah, wear your seatbelt, get a carbon monoxide detector. They're things that don't harm you and very much worthwhile. SENS hasn't cracked the code of long life yet, but it's trying to get there. One of the FAQs on the website asks, I want to stave off aging now. What diet, lifestyle, and supplement program would you recommend? Rather hilariously, the initial answer is, unfortunately, we cannot make those sorts of recommendations for the simple reason that despite marketing claims to the contrary, no currently available medical intervention or lifestyle choice has been shown to affect the basic human aging process. I guess that's kind of true, right? Like, you can exercise all you want, but it doesn't affect your aging. You're still going to age. It does clarify that if you make it to 75, genes do start playing a larger role in your continued existence. In a sense, living a healthy lifestyle has less to do with aging and more to do with avoiding killing yourself early by treating your body badly. Yeah, I think also, like, the quality of your life can, like, if you are healthy and fit and such things, when you get older, I feel like the quality of life you have is going to be higher. It finishes with the answer, the Foundation itself retains a sharp focus on its mission to advance rejuvenation biotechnologies and true damage repair. We're working to develop and ensure widespread access to these new medicines, but they don't exist right now, and it will be some time before they are available. That's one reason why we're working so hard to catalyze the application of regenerative medicine to the diseases and disabilities of aging. Kind of sounds like they're not really doing anything. Harsh. They want widespread access to non-existent medicines. Guess I'll put my name on the list and hopefully something will be ready by the time I hit the big 75. Anyway, de Grey's also insinuated himself into the Calment question. I joined the Facebook group mentioned earlier, and not only is Aubrey de Grey a member, Nikolai Zak is too. I wasn't expecting much recent activity in the group, but in a total coincidence, I joined on the day of what would have been Jeanne Calment's 150th birthday. There was a post mentioning this, with a reply from Nikolai Zak himself, still trumpeting his same old message. Jeanne was secretly treated for tuberculosis in Leysin, as confirmed by photographic evidence and testimony from the son of her doctor. She died at the age of 58 in 1934, but her identity was assumed by her daughter Yvonne since the end of 1932. DNA tests should be done to give Jeanne her own identity. For that, some honest people in France should approach the judge. He actually pops up a lot on the posts and has earned the title of top contributor to the page. The DNA issue is one that seems to be a sticking point, though. De Grey is also very interested in Calment's blood sample, as per an interview with Lauren Collins in the New Yorker piece, which is titled, Was Jeanne Calment the oldest person who ever lived, or a fraud? In fact, it was de Grey who published Zak's paper in his journal called Rejuvenation Research, leaving many people who had validated Jeanne Calment's life history in the past wondering what he was getting out of it and why he was publishing what they saw as a truly specious argument. Well, because he doesn't think it's specious. That's why. I don't think it's specious. I think it's quite accurate. Zak also presented his argument at an anti-aging conference in Berlin, sponsored by the SENS Foundation. I think this just indicates that the SENS Foundation is very much interested in science and reality, rather than being like, oh my god, look, this person lived to 122, we could do it too, this supports our message, which it would. But because they seem to be actual scientists and a decent journal, that's not what they're doing. De Grey has publicly stated that he's not 100% convinced by the identity switch idea, but has made several calls for the blood sample to be released. Yeah, I'm not 100% convinced by it. I think it takes a lot to be 100% convinced by it, but I am fairly convinced by it, and I'm not going to believe it until I see some proof of it, because I like not believing things until I see proof, because that just seems like the sensible way of doing things. It's not on this Zak guy and de Grey to prove a negative. He even explicitly appealed his wish to Michael Allard and Jean-Marie Rabin, two of the three-person team who originally validated Calment's age, along with another doctor, although they have so far ignored him. He also directly asks Lauren Collins, the journalist for the article. He thinks he has the sway to get famous French biologist Yves Christian involved. Quote, I believe it falls to the people like you, Christian. The single best thing you could do to save lives, to hasten the defeat of aging, is to get Christian and get him to see that he has the capacity to go to Dessay and get them to release that sample. Yeah, release the bloody sample. Come on, we've got a sample of her blood. Let's just test that shit. She didn't have any relatives. No one's going to care. The only people who are going to care are the people who are like championing her cause for no reason. Way to put the pressure on someone else to Gray. He had a similar mission in mind when he spoke to Phil Hode for a piece in The Guardian in 2019. I'm not sure if Katie's being sarcastic here, but I think this is a great way to put pressure on this issue. Because you could go on the podcast and say, it's really important that someone gets this sample released. But if you call someone out specifically, you're way more likely to get action because you don't have that whole someone else will do it. He's like being you. You can do it. You get it done. I think it's quite effective. He had a similar mission when he spoke to Phil Hode for a piece in The Guardian in 2019. When asked about the potential release of the sample, he said, "In the interests of saving lives, finding out more about aging to eventually postpone aging, then that's actually quite important." See? No mention of denouncing the oldest person in the world story, which he sort of hitched his wagon to with his relationship with Nikolai Zak, who is definitely in it for the fraud angle. Yeah, but he's got nothing to gain. He doesn't have anything to gain. He's just trying to point out the truth. It's a big no-no anyway from the foundation dossier that holds the sample. The sample was given on the assumption of anonymity and was only intended to be used for a certain set of things, so they just say their hands are tied. I mean, fair play, though. If you got a reason why you can't, you can't. As time goes by, it doesn't seem likely that they'll finally relent, so I guess we'll just have to decode this the old-fashioned way without the use of cutting-edge science. Luckily, it's not as hard as all that. Debunking the suspicions. According to her Guinness World Records page, the record holder credited her long life to a healthy diet with plenty of olive oil, which she also rubbed into her skin. However, she also indulged in chocolate from time to time and smoked from the age of 21 until she was 117. Jesus Christ, that must be I don't know if she smoked heavily. She is French, so probably. But that must be an extraordinary number of cigarettes. Indulged in chocolate from time to time, eh? Well, according to other articles I read, Jeanne ate 2 pounds, or just over a kilo of the good stuff every week. Now, that's a diet I can get behind. I mean, that's a lot of chocolate. I don't really eat chocolate. I'm on a health kick, but I could definitely eat a kilogram of chocolate a week. 100 grams of chocolate's like a big Milka bar, or a big Dairy Milk, or whatever Americans have. It's like a big bar of chocolate. Not crazy big, just a big bar. Like the bigger bar in the stores. The one they say is for sharing, but because you're a greedy, you eat it all yourself. That would be 1.5 of those a day, basically. If I wasn't worried about my health, I could crush that with zero trouble. We mentioned them briefly earlier, but Jeanne, a team of 3 people doing various things to validate her age claim while she was still alive. These people were Michelle Allard, a gerontologist or aging and older adult specialist, Jean-Marie Babine, a demographer who specializes in human population statistics, and her doctor, Victor Lebre. Through many hours of conversations and checking of historical data, they were confident that Jeanne Calment was indeed the world's oldest person. It wasn't until Nikolai Zak and Valery Novoselov came along in 2018 that they really had to defend their position at all. Or 2 of them did. Victor Lebre had already died. So let's check back in with Novoselov and Zak's claims and see if there really is anything to them. We'll start with the smaller stuff regarding the identity switch hypothesis. A lot of this so-called evidence rests on comparing photos of Yvonne and Jean at various ages. There aren't that many photos of Yvonne, personal photography not really being the huge thing in the early 20th century, or at least not many photos that people have been able to find. There is only one photo that has come to light which shows the 2 Calment ladies together as adults. It's a black and white shot of Yvonne perched on a bench or a chair with her mother, Jean, fiddling with some flowers that are on a table. Jean is looking down and Yvonne is looking at the camera, so it's difficult to even compare the 2 in the same shot as you can't see Jean's face in that much detail. They're dressed alike in what looks like blouses, cardigans and skirts, but they have different hairstyles, and Jean seems smaller than Yvonne, even though Yvonne's sitting down. Yeah, the face and stuff is not the stuff that I find more compelling. It's the fact that she's still super the same height as when she was younger. The fact that... what else was there? There was a whole bunch of stuff, and I was like, this just seems extremely suspicious. Research that Nikolai Zak has done into other photos of the 2 show what has been called a fibroma on a known photo of Yvonne. It's a little bump on the end of her nose. In a photo of Jean later in life, the bump is there again. This evidence, however, is just weak source. Yes, Jean has a bump in that photo, but doesn't have it in others. So how can this prove anything apart from that her and a direct biological relation might both be prone to getting spots on their noses? In his paper, Zak says, quote, "In one of the few photographs of the young Yvonne that exist, one can see a small fibroma on the nose. It could be a scan defect, but it's also visible on different scans. A similar fibroma can be seen in one of the photos of the old Calment. Interestingly, it is absent from her later photos, indicating that it was removed. If Yvonne removed it more than once, that could explain its slightly different locations, and also the fact that the fibroma appears smaller in the older woman, even though fibromas grow over time." So I'm assuming they can grow back, so you have it removed and then it grows again? I'm not even entirely sure what a fibroma is. Is that just like that thick skin you can sometimes get? Pardon me for sounding rude, Mr. Zach, but aren't you just proving the counter-argument as you go along? Zach is saying that fibromas grow over time, but weirdly, Yvonne's get smaller. Maybe that's because it's not the same person or the same fibroma. Either one or both women then had it removed, or it just disappeared over time naturally and came back every once in a while. That's not a compelling evidence for an identity switch. Jean's eye colour changing is also not compelling evidence for an identity switch. No, I agree with that. I don't think that's particularly compelling. It's like people's eye colour can change, or just not really change, but it can appear different. And certainly as you get older, your eyes can get more like cloudy. You get that, what's that thing? Is it cataracts, where your eyes go cloudy and change colour a little bit? While it was given as black on her official ID, it's more likely to have been dark brown. Her eyes do look more grey in later photos, but you could argue that they are greenish, and in some way they still look quite dark. So who's to say that the colour green in the 1930s is the most accurate one? I'm not sure what colour Yvonne's eyes were. There have also been comparisons of a younger Jeanne to an older Jeanne, and people have found discrepancies with ears, noses, and jawlines, etc. But this is not exact science, as people's ears and noses can change quite significantly over the course of their life, including all throughout adulthood, thanks to a loss of collagen, the breaking down of cartilage, and general gravity-induced sagging. Yay, so much fun stuff to look forward to. Is it an urban legend or whatever that your nose and ears continue to grow throughout your whole life? But I mean, not all old people have massive noses and ears. Anyway, if you compare any two photos of a person as a young adult and a very old adult, they're going to look very different. I mean, Jesus Christ, look at a photo of me from 10 years ago. Could a different young adult who looked similar actually be that older adult? Maybe, but in this case, it's not strong enough to project how Yvonne might have looked at age 100 plus compare it to photos of old age Jeanne. From existing photos of younger Jeanne, there's nothing that can disprove that the old lady is her. How about the height discrepancy? She was supposedly 150 centimeters at 114 years old, just 2 centimeters shorter than she'd been in the 1930s. Does this indicate that she was, in fact, taller than Yvonne? Well, I'm not really sure where the 150 centimeter number came from, as according to Lauren Collins from the New Yorker article, Jeanne was actually 143 when she died, when she died, or a rather teeny 4 foot 7 inches, which means that this is in line with what you'd expect to lose, as you and Danny DeVito got the last laugh after all. I also saw an even smaller number of 137 attributed to her validating team, which means that 150 number is just way off. Okay, so one of the most convincing elements is seemingly debunked. Okay, that's the physical side of things. What about the other stuff? Yvonne wasn't listed as living in the large Calment apartments in 1931, and neither was Jeanne, although the rest of the family are. There's no real issue here. According to Allard and Robin, 1931 was the first year that the censuses in France were typewritten, and there were typos galore. Jeanne is not named, however. Marie Calment, Jeanne's mother-in-law, is named twice, listed once as spouse with an 1847 birth date erased, and once as mother with a birth date of 1847. So I think it's pretty clear that the first Maria is actually supposed to be Jeanne, and it's just a mistake. If you're Nikolai Zach, however, you might say something like this in your argument. An alternative interpretation is that Jeanne's health was by then in decline, and the family was already in the early steps of devising an ID switch plan, leading them to provide obfuscating information. I suppose that's plausible, but is it likely? Not really. And if you're wondering why Yvonne is not mentioned at all, it's because she was in Switzerland getting treatment for her tuberculosis. The Facebook group of Jeanne's supporters managed to figure this out by finding a photo of Yvonne as a young adult and deducing the location of her photo as being a sanatorium in Leysen, Switzerland. The photograph was dated to August 1931. They also found letters confirming that Yvonne's health had been so bad that her husband had requested a 5-year leave of absence from the military starting in 1928 to help look after her, and he requested another absence in 1933. Basically, all the information pointing to Yvonne having been very ill when there is no such information to be found about Jeanne. Zach points to Yvonne's death certificate as having been signed by a seemingly random old lady with no medical expertise or particular knowledge of the family, hinting that she wouldn't have known if the bodies of Yvonne and Jeanne had been switched. The thing is, in 1934, death certificates didn't have to be signed by a medical professional. According to Eric Leborg, writing for Médecins Sciences, quote, "For this act, the declarant may be a relative but not necessarily, and it is often nowadays a funeral worker. The witness does not need to know the deceased to declare the death in City Hall. Additionally, only one witness is required. In short, Yvonne's death certificate is perfectly commonplace." So, this wasn't really that suspicious after all. I still think one of the big things is just how much of an outlier she is. Like, no one has ever been able to do this, except for her. And there's these suspicions around her. And what about Yvonne's name not being on the family tomb? Is that because she was actually still alive and had accidentally forgotten that she was supposed to be dead? It's kind of surprising when you can clearly see the names of her husband and son there together, but no mention of Yvonne. The tomb itself is made of black granite, with the surnames Jeanne Calment below on one end. On a raised bit in the middle is what looks like an open book with Jeanne Calment and her dates on one side, La Doyenne de l'Humanité on the other. At the back is another piece, sorry, I'm not familiar with tomb vernacular, with a cross and Joseph and Frederick Below's names engraved on it. You might also notice that while there are 3 family names on the tomb, only 3 individuals are actually mentioned on it. There's no Fernand or his relatives, there's no Gilles Reps either, whoever they are. So really, it's not that weird that Yvonne didn't make the cut. Also, she died a lot earlier than her husband and son, predeceasing them by almost 30 years. According to the Facebook sleuths again, this tomb was restored in the 1960s, so only people who died after that, i.e. Joseph, Frederick, and Jean, were specifically engraved onto it. Everyone else is just implied. Let's talk about the inconsistent memories and life facts now. I think we can all agree that nobody's memory is going to be 100% accurate at 100 plus years of age, unless they're one of those supercomputer memories, which Jean didn't. The fact that she said things like her father owned the store instead of her husband isn't really a smoking gun as far as I'm concerned. It's not like she said, my father Fernand. She never named anyone. When commenting on Van Gogh visiting the store, Jean wasn't attached to it yet as she was a girl and hadn't yet married Fernand, so saying that it was either her father or husband's store would have been wrong at the time anyway. It would have belonged to her future father-in-law, but who can be bothered to keep saying that all the time when people are interested in the Van Gogh aspect of the anecdote, not how you were or weren't related to the store's owner. Yeah, that's fair enough. That's definitely fair enough. Other discrepancies with age and names can just be put down to things getting mixed up. It's easy to do. Calment gave names that weren't necessarily correct, so people had to guess who she might have meant. Her speech later in life was hard to understand, clearly, adding another layer of difficulty to figuring out who she meant. It was clear that she knew things that only Jean, not her daughter, could have known, though she sometimes used words that were so old-fashioned her interviewers had to look them up. She remembered things like the company who had made her wedding cutlery and who her maths teacher was. This wasn't necessarily enough for Nikolai Zach, though, who thought that Yvonne could have learned these details herself and wouldn't have needed first-hand knowledge of them. Talking to Lauren Collins, he says, I'm younger than my father by 34 years, and I'm not very close with him, but I know the name of his maths teacher. Really? That's weak. That's weak, Zach. I don't remember the name of my maths teachers. Nah, that's not true. I could at least name some. But I don't know the name of my dad's teachers. Why would I? Good for you, Nikolai, but I think you're a tiny minority here. I know the name of one school my dad went to, but as for teachers he had, forget about it. I don't even know that. And this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I had to ask my mum what city she was born in the other day, so count me out for an identity switch scam in the future. That sounds like someone who's preparing for an identity switch. Sounds like what they would say, Katie. I don't think Jean's signature changing is much of a red flag either. Who hasn't experimented with how they write their name? Sure, maybe you stick to a certain style in adulthood, but I started signing my name differently on a touchscreen than I do with a pen, and I'm considering changing my handwriting signature, as the way it comes out with my finger actually looks cooler. I probably won't end up doing this, I'm just making the point that a changing letter in a signature doesn't necessarily mean anything. No, it definitely doesn't. Like, I recently got a new passport and I looked at my signature from my passport, which was like a decade ago, and my signature used to be way neater, and now it's just a mess. Because as an adult, you gotta sign so much more shit. And it's like, just signing things all the time. Nikolai Zach also thinks a couple of important omissions in Jean's interviews of her life story point to an identity switch, namely a house move she made as a teen, and that she never mentioned the cholera outbreak in Arles. With the house move, I mean, who really cares? My daughter isn't 13 and has lived at least 7 different addresses, but probably couldn't even remember or name 3 of them, although most of the moving occurred when she was very young. When digging deeper into historical records, Allard and Robin did come across some information about this move, but again, it hardly blew the conspiracy case wide open. In an article called The Real Facts Supporting Jeanne Calment as the Oldest Human Ever, they say, indeed, we did not learn about this move during our interviews with JC. But we have since determined that the move was only 150 meters away in the same neighborhood in 1884 or 1885 when JC was 9 or 10, not 13 years old. We do not feel it is remarkable that a minor move such as this at the age of 10 would not be mentioned. Exactly. And with the cholera epidemic, I looked it up and it hardly ran rampant through the streets of Arles. 6 people died within 24 hours, but that's the only death toll I could find. So as a 9-year-old at the time, I doubt Jeanne would have really worried that much about it or even knew what was happening. Wow, this is really big. Zach, I'm sorry, mate. I was really on your side, but this kind of argument's kind of been dismantled. Your arguments are being pretty well dismantled, my dude. I still think the thing about the statistic thing, about her just being such an outlier, is definitely weird, but I'm kind of coming back around, so maybe this is real. Zach also found it suspicious that Jeanne didn't really become that well known until she moved into a nursing home at the age of 110, but that's the thing about long life. Nobody knows about you until you really start getting up there. Who cares about some 105-year-old when there are people 10 years older knocking about? A well-preserved 110-year-old, though. Now we're talking. And of course, as she persisted, so her fame grew. If you've been wondering at all about the insurance aspect of the story, here are your answers. Wait, I don't remember the insurance thing. While it did seem as though... I think Katie must mean inheritance. While it did seem as though the Calments had been hammered over inheritance taxes and whatnot, it might not have been as bad as we originally thought. In his paper, Zach speculates perhaps the Calment family suffered from taxation after the death of Maria Felix. If I can like that. I suffer from taxation. Widow of the founder of the store, Jacques Calment, and especially after the death of Jean's father, Nicolas Calment, the owner of the land and real estate in the surrounding villages in 1931. The inheritance for the farm in Saint-Martin-de-Crau would amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern money. It's not hard to imagine that the family had neither desire nor ability to pay the tax, especially twice in a row. Here, one should recall that Jeanne hated socialists. Allah and Rabin to the rescue once more. In their rebuttal, they point out that Zach handily ignores key details of the Calment financial setup, which had been in place for years, even before Yvonne's death. They say Zach is negligent in not noting that Nicolas Calment had given all his property to his children on March 15th, 1926, in exchange for an annual annuity of 5,000 francs that his children had to pay him until his death. The only financial consequence of the death of NC in 1931 is the extinction of the life annuity. Okay, so he'd given all the property over before so he could avoid the inheritance tax. I told you there was a better way to avoid this. They also accessed publicly available real estate transactions and deeds and found no evidence of a massive amount of inheritance tax ever being due. Another member of the Facebook sleuth group also discovered that far from being taxed 30% or more if Jeanne had died in 1934, it would have only been about 6% of her total assets. They also found that she'd inherited a tidy sum from her father when he died in 1926, so they're actually a pretty good position overall, with no need to defraud anybody. No, I don't know. Yeah, faking... I said earlier, living your life for someone else is not worth it for avoiding 30% inheritance tax, is definitely not worth it to avoid 6%. I mean, unless you own Samsung or something. Interestingly, Aubrey de Grey pops up again here with another question about the finances, which he posted. I earlier was like, yeah, I'm 90% sure or whatever that this is fake. But now I've heard all the rebuttal, I'm like, I don't know. This seems quite legit. But this is the problem. There doesn't seem to be a ton of evidence either way. There's not a lot of evidence to support it. The evidence against it's pretty weak, but you don't have to prove a negative. Which he posted in the Facebook group in March 2019. He agrees that the tax argument is weak, so queries it from a different angle. As we know, and it was mentioned in the paper, Fernand's drapery store closed in 1937. What do we know about why it closed? In the paper, it suggested that maybe the store closed because of financial difficulties. If so, maybe those difficulties were already severe in 1934, and if so, even a modest saving of tax arising from the lower rates that people here have identified might have constituted a large motive. Yeah, but not large enough to live your life as someone else. Conversely, if the store closed for other reasons, not related to financial hardship, then it remains likely that the family were financially secure throughout that period, so the motive arising from saving a rather small amount of tax is small and therefore not very plausible. Therefore, I think the balance of evidence for and against the ID switch hypothesis would be significantly shifted depending on the reason why the store closed. Does anyone know anything about that? Oh, Aubrey, I think you're asking the best group of online detectives on the planet. Of course somebody knew something about that. In fact, it was Francois Robin Champignon who came up with the best explanation, and he has also been the main researcher of all the tax stuff too. He basically said that the store had been sold, not closed, in 1938. Fernand was going to be 70, so it seemed a pretty good age to retire. Fernand's daughter Yvonne had died, her husband Joseph was going back to the military, and Frederick was only 11 at the time, so couldn't take over anyway. Jeanne herself had never been particularly involved in the running of the store, so voila, case closed. The only lingering suspicious thing, really, is that Jeanne asked for her personal documents to be destroyed when she was in the nursing home. Zach writes in his rejuvenation research paper, quote, "It is somewhat suggestive that Jeanne decided to destroy the photos and other documents when she was requested to send them to the archives of Arles. Being in the nursing home and not being able to destroy the documents herself, Jeanne resorted to the help of a distant relative. Intriguingly, that relative, a niece of Joseph Bilot named Madame Bigonet, was Calment's heiress, so she had multiple motives to help perpetrate an ID switch secret. However, in the context of the pattern of behavior documented here, it becomes plausible that this destruction was a result of cold calculation and acute necessity instead of an emotional act." Yeah, it is weird. Like, why would you want to destroy all your documents? You're gonna die. Who gives a...
That's weird.
I think we can see by now that practically all of Zach's ideas are just that. They're just ideas. He doesn't present facts, just suppositions. Anyway, Lauren Collins also went deep into this for the New Yorker article and came to the conclusion that a family conflict lay at the heart of the decision, as there was still one living link to Jeanne Calment, Renée Bilot Bonnery, the widow of Jeanne's grandson Frederick. Collins writes, "Several sources suggested to me that Bonnery and Calment had a dispute after Freddie's death. The desire to keep such conflict private could help explain why Calment chose to destroy her personal papers. It could also attest to her authenticity. If Calment had been involved in a scam, it's conceivable that Bonnery would have known and have been motivated to expose her. I sent a letter to Bonnery and contacted a relative of hers who eventually asked me to leave them alone." It's probably because you're annoying. So I guess that's speculation too, but it seems more likely than Zach's hypothesis. Jeanne's character actually didn't do her many favors, with the people saying she was pretty bossy and condescending, so if there had been a switch, it would have been a lot of people just itching to let the cat out of the bag to get their own back, but it never happened. Going back to the original hoax suggester, Valery Novoselov, his whole issue stemmed from the fact that Jeanne just looked too young to be so old. He wasn't all in on the identity switch hypothesis, but his idea was that Jeanne managed to fudge her official age. Unfortunately for him, Jean's validating team of Michael Allard and Jean-Marie Rubin had literal receipts going back decades. Oh, okay, if you care to look, they published a list of census reports dating from 1876 that mentioned Jeanne, apart from one with two Marias that we mentioned earlier. Documentation, such as what Allard and Robin used, has helped winkle out other supposed supercentenarians in the past when it was discovered that a father and son had the same name, for example, or that dates just didn't match up. As they write at the end of their presentation, this is not the case for Jeanne Calment, quoting them. "As regards Jean-Louise Calment, a centenarian who has been known since 1985 when she was 110 and who was 122 years old when she died, there is a perfect chaining of the information on the 4 generations having preceded her, i.e. birth, marriage and death dates of her 2, 4, 8 and 16 grandparents. I.e. birth, marriage, and death dates of her 2, 4, 8, and 16 parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, covering the 1723 to 1931 period of grandchildren of time, and on 2 generations after her, i.e. birth and marriage and death dates of children and grandchildren, covering the 1898 to 1963 period. On the whole, the chaining covers 7 generations from 1723 to 1963. With the complementary direct documents, we have, from her birth to her death, a perfect chaining from 1875 to 1997. In particular, with a perfect chaining constituted by 14 direct documents from population censuses from 1876 to 1975, the year of her 100th birthday. Well, honestly, that sounds like pretty locked down, doesn't it? That sounds like some pretty good evidence. While old Zach, who I used to love and was kind of in his corner, he's kind of just guessing. I'd call this a slam dunk, but Novoselov is still not totally convinced. In conversation with Lauren Collins, he showed her a picture of Calment around 80 years old and said, "That woman is still full of estrogen. She is just entering the early stages of menopause. It's clear that hormonally, she is still a woman. Because as we all know, after menopause, women aren't women anymore. They're just husks. I don't know if that's an accidentally sexist thing that he said there, but it sounds really bad. Okay, one, I take offense. Okay, good. I take offense with the fact that this dude thinks women are not hormonally still women after menopause, so screw you. But more to the point too, if Jeanne is going to live for 4 decades from the time the picture was taken, she's going to be 1 in 7 billion who just ages slower. If she aged at the same rate as everyone else, she wouldn't get to 122, or she'd be an absolute shriveled walnut. Nobody can say for sure if Calment didn't hit the menopause until her 80s, but what we can say is that the whole reason she lived so long is because her body just took longer to age. We should look at her DNA and extract that. Like, whatever. We should start, with the viruses? Gene therapy. We should gene therapy ourselves with her genes. I know it doesn't work like that, but it would be cool. Yes, we can say that she smoked and ate chocolate all the time, but she wasn't a chain smoker. She'd only have a couple a day after a meal. She never had any serious medical complaints or illnesses and had led a very active lifestyle, mountaineering with her husband, swimming, skating and cycling everywhere. She was still riding a bike at the age of 100. Holy shit! Even at 110 in the nursing home, Jeanne was sticking to a regime that included morning exercises. In fact, nothing that serious happened to her until later in life when she fractured a leg at age 100 and had a mild heart failure at 111. Her genes were all aiming towards a longer lifespan too, with her older brother making it to 97, her mother clocking out at 86, and her father making it to 93. Not bad for a shipwright born in 1837. Yeah, my great-grandmother cracked 100. I think she died at 101. And yeah, the rest of them, well, both my granddads died when they were like 50, but one had a disease, and that's like that I don't have, and the other had... I don't know much. I don't know much about my family. But let's just hope I got that 100-year-old gene. She did deteriorate fairly rapidly over the last few years of her life, though, and while her mental state was still pretty good, she couldn't really see or hear, which in itself probably contributed to her downfall, as she couldn't carry on with her daily routines. In pictures of her in the last couple of years of life, it's definitely caught up with her, and she looks really, really old. I think we've covered the main debunkings of the identity switch idea, which just leaves one thing to mention: the sheer improbability of Yvonne taking on Jeanne's identity. Okay, I suppose that neither of these things is likely. One, a daughter living as her mother for 60-ish years, or two, a woman living to 122 and a half, but one of those that happened, which means the other did not. Let's just think about that. If Yvonne had taken on the identity of her mother for financial reasons, that's one thing people have done to claim pensions and benefits after their parents have died, but most of the time, it's on paper. They don't assume the life and identity of the dead person in the real world, or if they do it not for 60 years, totally undetected. Yvonne was only 23 years younger than her mother, but she still would have had to be pretending to be a 59-year-old when she was only 36. She would have had to pretend to be her own husband's mother-in-law, her own son's grandmother, and her own father's wife. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Can you imagine a 7-year-old being able to keep that secret? The Calments didn't live in an isolated bubble. Their store was practically an institution, and they were a well-known family. Jean's father had been a member of the city council, and according to Ayard and Rabin, Yvonne's husband was a member of the French Legion of Honor, which would have meant that his name, at least, would have been well known in certain circles. Yvonne and Jeanne were active in their own social groups, and it would have been pretty obvious if so-called Jeanne suddenly started showing up to her music club looking like her daughter. Detractors argue that Arles was a large place, but it really wasn't. And as we said, the Calments were known around and about, and both Yvonne and Jeanne knew a lot of different people. For this ruse to have worked, it wasn't just census takers and admin workers who would have to be fooled. It would have had to be almost the entire city of Arles, including officials such as a notary who was present to witness Jean's marriage in 1896, Yvonne's marriage in 1926, and a house sale with Jeanne in 1931, when, according to Zag, Yvonne had already started taking over her mother's identity. They also knew each other socially, so it seems unlikely that he would have been taken in by Yvonne pretending to be Jeanne. A petition was started in 2019 on change.org calling for the exhumations of Jeanne and Yvonne in the interests of science and for the search for truth. The petition starter calls on Emmanuel Macron to make the decision. After 6 years, this petition has garnered 327 signatures. And no word from Macron, so good luck with that. I don't think they should exhume them, that's weird. Just test that blood. Before he went down something of a rabbit hole with his hypotheses, Nikolai Zak was initially saying that a person living to 122 is mathematically impossible. But that's the thing. It was only impossible because it hadn't yet been proven to happen. Now it has, so mathematical goalposts will have to shift. Let's just say it's mathematically improbable, shall we? The current oldest person in the world is a nun from Brazil, aged a sprightly 116, and as it stands, there are 50 known people alive in the world right now that have been validated as being over 112. They're coming for Calment, slowly but surely, but so far, no one's managed to get near enough to wipe out that longevity crown. Yeah, and honestly, for 6 years difference at that age is an absolutely massive difference. Calment lived through 2 world wars, 20 French presidents, as well as being the oldest person in general. She holds the world record for oldest actress for her appearance at the age of 114 in the aforementioned Vincent and Me film. She appeared as herself though, so I don't know if that's technically acting. She also released an EP called Maîtresse du Temps, or Mistress of Time, in 1996, a year before her death. I do not recommend seeking this out. The radio edit of Le Farandole de Jeanne is what sounds like early 90s kids' TV music, with a child asking her questions and snippets of Jeanne's responses. She's barely intelligible, and I stopped listening after about a minute, having got the general idea. Wait, wouldn't it be in French? Do you speak French, Katie? That's cool. A farandole is a type of lively dance, in case you were wondering. There's also a club version of the same track, but I don't think it would have packed dance floors in mid-90s Ibiza. Personally, I'm convinced that Jeanne managed what no one else has done so far and lived to over 120. But there are those who won't believe it, no matter how much data is thrown in their faces. I suppose it won't be until some sort of blood or DNA testing is done that some people will be convinced. But as it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon, I think we'll just have to rely on a perfect chaining of historical records, a track record of long-lived blood relatives, and good common sense. Yeah, I agree. When the arguments against it were presented, I was like, those are pretty good arguments, but Katie dismantled them, and now I'm on the team Jeanne. I think she probably did live to be that old. The historical documentation seems pretty fucking solid. Obviously, it's not absolute proof, but absolute proof is rare. Thanks for watching.